There are moments when silence speaks louder than screams, and when a single step into the wrong building at the right time unravels a lie buried for generations. The Langford Encumbered Bank was the kind of place that gleamed with quiet arrogance. It sat at the heart of Rockwell Square, an old money district built on whispered legacies and polished marble floors. Its lobby exuded confidence. Crystal chandeliers, vaulted ceilings, brass railings, and the ever-present hum of transactional power. Customers moved through it like clockwork. Pressed suits, designer heels, sharp voices softened by good breeding. It was a world where nothing unexpected ever happened, until he walked in. The old man stepped through the glass doors with the weight of a century in his bones. He wore a faded trench coat, more patch than fabric, and carried a rough canvas sack slung over his shoulder. His boots were cracked, soles nearly detached. His face, lined with hardship, was a canvas of time itself, wrinkles etched not just by age but by years of being unseen. No one noticed him at first. Why would they? To them, he was a drifter, a relic, an eyesore. But within seconds, the hush that followed his entrance became louder than any noise could ever be. He didn't flinch at the glares or the whispered insults. Didn't react when a woman pulled her purse closer. Didn't acknowledge the bank teller who rolled his eyes and mumbled, "Must have wandered in from the shelter." Instead, Isaiah Bennett walked to the center of the lobby, slowly, deliberately. Each step was steady, heavy, as though he'd rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in his mind. When he reached the polished tile at the lobby's center, he stopped, looked up at the domed ceiling, and spoke. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the air like a bell. "This bank is mine." For a second, no one moved. Then came the laughter. It started with a smirk, a scoff, and then erupted into waves of mocking amusement, like the room had been waiting for a punchline. Someone muttered, "Must be senile." Another joked, "Maybe he thinks this is 1850. Isaiah didn't blink. He didn't explain. He didn't apologize. Instead, he simply stood there, upright, unshaken, as the ridicule swelled around him like a storm he'd weathered many times before. In the far corner, Grant Sawyer, the head of security, stood up from his post. A former Marine turned glorified guard dog. Grant prided himself on keeping the nonsense out. He was tall, broad, and wore his authority like a badge he'd earned in battle. As he marched forward, hand resting on the leather strap of his holster, the crowd parted. He approached Isaiah with a sneer etched deep into his square jaw. "Sir," he said, voice laced with thinly veiled contempt, "this ain't a soup kitchen. You don't belong here. Let's not make a scene." Isaiah turned slowly. His eyes, dark, steady, unblinking, met Grant's with a quiet power. "I'm not here to make a scene," Isaiah said. "I'm here to reclaim what's mine." Grant raised a brow. "Oh, yeah? And what might that be?" Isaiah looked around the lobby, looked at the marble floors, the grand staircase, and the gold-etched nameplate that read Langford Co. "Everything," he said simply. That's when the bank manager emerged. Charles Denvers was the picture of composure. Young, sharp-suited, Ivy League polish oozing from every pore. He moved with the confidence of a man born into access. His words were curated. His smile was calculated. But as he approached, there was a flicker of discomfort in his eyes. "Is there a problem here?" Charles asked, looking between Grant and the stranger. Before Grant could answer, Isaiah took a step forward. He gently lowered the canvas sack to the floor. The lobby grew quieter. "There's no problem," Isaiah said, still calm. "Just a truth that's waited too long to be spoken." And with that, he reached into the bag. Grant's hand immediately tightened on his holster. Several customers took a cautious step back. A woman gasped. But Isaiah's movements were slow, measured, deliberate. From the sack, he pulled a thick, time-worn ledger, its leather cover faded, edges torn by decades of wear. He held it up with both hands, and for the first time since he walked in, his voice carried with full conviction. "This is the founding ledger of Langford Co. Bank. The year is written on the first page, 1951, and the name on that page is mine, Isaiah C.K. Bennett." A silence heavier than marble fell upon the lobby. Charles looked pale. Grant looked confused. The staff looked stunned. But Isaiah wasn't done. "Before it was Langford Co., he continued. This bank was something else, built from nothing by two hands, one black, one white. My partner took the credit, and I was erased. He didn't raise his voice, didn't look for pity. He simply laid the ledger on the front desk. This bank doesn't belong to liars. It belongs to the truth. And I've carried that truth for over 70 years. He stepped back, and for the first time that day, no one laughed. For a long moment, no one moved. The leather-bound ledger sat on the desk like a relic from another era, silent, heavy, and undeniable. Its presence shifted something in the room. You could feel it, like the first crack appearing on the surface of a marble statue, quiet but fatal. Charles Denvers, the bank manager, felt his throat tighten. It wasn't just the old man's calm that unsettled him. It was the eerie certainty in his voice. People made outrageous claims every week. Some thought their accounts had secret inheritances. Others claimed the Federal Reserve owed them millions. But this felt different. He looked at the ledger, then at the old man. "Mr. Bennett, is it?" Charles asked, trying to keep his voice even. Isaiah nodded once. "This document," Charles continued carefully. "Where did you get it?" "I didn't get it," Isaiah said. "I wrote it." That answer, spoken so plainly, stole the breath from the room. You could almost hear the mechanical clicks of minds trying to make sense of the claim. Charles leaned in slightly, his eyes scanning the weathered cover. It was dated March 17, 1951. The ink had faded to a dusty brown, but the handwriting on the first page remained visible. Initial capital record, Langford Bennett Bank. Charles's heart skipped. Langford Bennett? That name, Bennett, had never appeared in any version of the bank's official history. Not in board meetings, not in plaques, not in archives. Only the Langfords were remembered, honored, and enshrined in the walls. But here it was. Undeniable. Handwritten. Bound in aged leather and time. This doesn't prove ownership," Charles said, his voice faltering. "I mean, it could be anything." "Then turn the page," Isaiah said gently. Charles hesitated, then slowly flipped the first sheet. There it was. Page 2, Founding Signatures. 2 names, 2 hands, 2 lives etched into the paper like ghosts refusing to rest. Preston Langford, Isaiah C.K. Bennett. Below the names were dollar amounts, property transactions, ledger entries of cash deposits, a blueprint of something built together. Charles took a step back, visibly rattled. His voice dropped lower, as if trying to keep the walls from listening. "Even if this is real," he said, "even if you were involved at the beginning, that doesn't mean you still—" Isaiah cut in quietly. "I was never bought out, never compensated, never even acknowledged. They took my name, my share, my dignity, and buried it beneath marble and brass." Charles looked around the lobby. Clients were no longer giggling or whispering. They were watching, some with skepticism, others, more than a few, with something that looked eerily like guilt. Grant Sawyer, the security guard, wasn't having it. He stepped closer, puffing his chest. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "You're telling me some homeless old man walks in with a notebook, and now we're supposed to believe he owns the damn bank?" Charles turned sharply. "Grant." "No, Charles. Someone needs to say it. This man has no ID, no proof of anything modern, just a dusty book and a story. You really want to risk the entire institution's reputation on that?" Isaiah didn't look offended. If anything, he looked tired. "I expected that," he said, facing Grant directly. "You've been trained to doubt voices like mine, trained to protect a system that was never made for people like me." He turned to Charles again. "I didn't come here to beg. I came to remind this building of who helped to lay its foundation. You don't have to believe me now, but you will have to choose what you do next." The weight of those words landed hard. Charles glanced again at the ledger. He wanted to dismiss it, wanted to pretend this was all an elaborate ruse. But something in his gut, something deeper than logic or policy, whispered otherwise. That book, that name, the quiet resolve in Isaiah's voice, it all felt real. He suddenly became aware of his reflection in the gold trim of the counter. How many times had he passed the framed photo of Preston Langford at the top of the staircase? How many times had he given speeches about legacy and pride? And yet, there had always been gaps. No documents before 1952. No records of the first transaction. No proof of the original co-founder. Until now. Mr. Bennett, Charles said slowly, I want to be very clear. If what you're saying is true, this goes far beyond me. This is about board members, legal teams, and family holdings. You're talking about rewriting 70 years of history. Isaiah nodded. Yes, and I've carried that truth alone for 70 years. It's time someone else held it too. In the silence that followed, Amelia Brooks, the youngest employee in the branch, stepped forward. She had been quietly watching from behind the reception desk, her eyes wide and hands trembling slightly. She reached for the ledger, hesitated, then looked at Isaiah. May I? She asked. He nodded. With care, she turned a few pages, and in a voice barely above a whisper said, My grandmother used to tell me stories about a man named Bennett. Said he built the first bank in town, but no one ever believed her. She looked up, eyes wide with realization. Maybe she wasn't wrong. A long silence, one that Charles didn't break, one that Isaiah didn't need to fill, because the truth was already starting to speak. In worn ink, in faded pages, in a name finally spoken aloud. And though the walls of Langford Co still stood tall, a deep crack had just formed. Outside, the sky had dimmed. Sunlight filtered through the tall glass windows of Langford Co Bank, casting golden streaks onto the marble floors. Light that touched everything except the truth still lingering in the air. The bank lobby had fallen into a hushed state of stillness, and in that stillness, the weight of history pressed down like gravity. Charles Denvers stood frozen, the old ledger still open in front of him. The signature, Isaiah C.K. Bennett, stared back up at him like a forgotten verdict. One he had unknowingly upheld his entire career. He was a man trained to maintain order. He prided himself on control, routine, and outcomes. But now something ancient and ungovernable had entered his lobby and refused to leave. From behind, the hum of a ringing landline cut through the silence. Sir, said Amelia softly, it's the executive office. They've been alerted to a disturbance. Of course, the security feeds, the watchful eyes of the Langfords. Nothing in this building went unnoticed, especially not something like this. Charles picked up the receiver, composing his tone. Yes, this is Denvers. A pause, then a cold, clipped voice responded. Mr. Denvers, this is Whitney Langford. We're watching the footage. Remove the man, discreetly if possible. Call the police if he resists. Charles glanced toward Isaiah, who stood calmly beside the ledger watching. There was no threat in his posture, only presence. He claims to have documentation, Charles said, keeping his voice even. Original records, a ledger with both founding signatures. The other end of the line fell silent for a beat. Then, that man is a fraud, a relic from a false memory. I don't care if he walks in with Moses tablets. Escort him out immediately, or I'll find someone else who will. The line went dead. Charles lowered the phone slowly. His jaw tightened. Across the room, Grant Sawyer, still reeling from earlier, watched Charles carefully. Need me to handle this? He asked, one hand still hovering near his holster. Charles didn't answer right away. He looked again at the ledger, at the signature, at the fading bills, the yellowed receipts, the brittle paper holding 7 decades of silence. And then at Isaiah, who said nothing, but whose presence asked everything. No, Charles replied at last. You'll stand down, Grant. No one is being removed. Grant blinked. You serious? Deadly. It was the first time in years anyone had heard steel in Charles Denver's voice. Even Grant hesitated. Charles turned to Amelia. Clear the lobby, hon, he said. We're closing for a private audit. Get legal on standby. Amelia nodded, heart pounding, and moved to lock the front doors. A few customers grumbled but didn't resist. They could feel the current shift. Within minutes, the bank lobby emptied, leaving only Isaiah, Charles, Amelia, Grant, and a few shell-shocked employees who lingered behind the counters. The silence returned. Charles walked slowly toward Isaiah. If you're telling the truth, he said quietly, we're about to walk into a storm. Isaiah's eyes met his, calm, deep. I've lived inside the storm for most of my life, Mr. Denvers. It's the world outside it I've never known. Those words landed heavier than any accusation. Charles gave a slight nod. A truce had formed, but just then, the sound of clicking heels echoed down the side hallway. A tall woman in her early 60s swept into the lobby like a gust of winter wind. Tailored gray suit, hair in a sleek platinum twist, and eyes colder than the vaults in the basement. Whitney Langford, the great-granddaughter of Preston Langford, chairwoman of the Langford Trust, and the unofficial monarch of Rockwell's banking dynasty. "Mr. Denvers," she said crisply, "step aside." Charles hesitated, then did. Whitney strode forward until she stood directly in front of Isaiah. She didn't offer a greeting. She didn't acknowledge the ledger. "You've made quite the spectacle," she said flatly. Isaiah looked at her as if he were seeing an echo of the past. The same arrogance, the same polished cruelty. "I didn't come to perform," he replied. "I came to be seen." Whitney gave a dry smile. "You have no claim. Whatever fantasy you've conjured up, it won't survive the light of law. My family has owned this institution for generations." Isaiah calmly reached into his coat and pulled out another document. An old deed, stamped and notarized from 1951. Beneath the ink, both names again, Langford and Bennett. He placed it beside the ledger. "Then explain this." Whitney didn't move. Charles leaned in and read silently. His breath caught. The founding property, the land this bank was built, was deeded jointly, but nowhere in any modern record had Isaiah's name appeared. "These records were buried," Charles whispered. "No," Isaiah corrected. "They were erased." Whitney Langford remained still, her expression unreadable. But something behind her eyes flickered. Panic, recognition, maybe even guilt. She turned to Charles, her voice lowering but sharper. "If you go down this road," she warned, "you will destroy this bank. You'll destroy your career. Do you understand that?" Charles looked at the documents, then at Isaiah, then at the wall behind the teller line, where a plaque read, "Founded 1951 to Preston Langford." He took a deep breath. "Maybe it's time we updated the plaque." Whitney Langford's eyes narrowed. The gauntlet had been thrown. She turned on her heel and walked out. The storm had officially begun. Rain had begun to fall outside. Thin streaks of water slid down the tall windows of Langford Co. Bank, blurring the outside world. But inside the lobby, everything was sharper, clearer. The truth had been named, the past unearthed, and now the storm had found its voice. Whitney Langford's departure didn't end the tension. It multiplied it. The click of her heels had barely faded when Charles's office phone lit up again, this time flashing red. He didn't need to answer to know what it meant. The Langford family had activated their full defense, and it was going to be brutal. Charles sat behind his desk in the glass-walled office that overlooked the lobby. The old ledger and deed lay between him and Isaiah Bennett, untouched since Whitney had seen them. "There will be lawyers," Charles said, his voice low. "Threats, smears, maybe even arrests." Isaiah didn't flinch. "Let them come." Charles glanced up. There was no arrogance in Isaiah's voice, just endurance, the weariness of a man who had already lost everything once. "I need to know something," Charles said, folding his hands. "Why now? Why come back after all these years?" Isaiah leaned back slowly, the chair creaking beneath him. "Because the lie outlived me." He let the words settle before continuing. "I kept quiet for decades, hoped the system would fix itself. Thought maybe one day someone would ask the right question. But no one did." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Not until you." Charles didn't speak, but the air between them shifted subtly, irrevocably. The bank manager and the forgotten founder were no longer at odds. They were now bound by the truth neither could unsee. Just then, Amelia Brooks knocked lightly on the glass and entered. In her hands were printed emails, internal memos, flagged with urgency. "Legal counsel just forwarded a notice," she said, placing the papers on the table. "The Langford board is officially denying your claims. They're threatening to file a trespassing suit against Mr. Bennett within the hour." Charles scanned the documents. The language was cold, clinical. False claims of ownership, he read aloud. Fabricated documentation. Unlawful disruption of operations. He exhaled, disgusted. They're trying to drown the truth in paperwork. Isaiah didn't look surprised. They buried me under it once. But this time, I came prepared. From his canvas bag, Isaiah pulled out another folder, this one newer, marked by recent stamps and legal notations. Freedom of Information Act, he said. Filed it 8 years ago. Took 5 more to get what I needed. He opened the folder. Inside were copies of land deeds, suppressed property transactions, and internal memos from 1952, one of which clearly stated that Isaiah Bennett's name had been removed from public documents to preserve the public image of ownership. Charles's breath hitched. They scrubbed you. Like I never existed, Isaiah replied. His voice was even. Too even. The kind of stillness only survivors learn. Charles stood, moved to the window, and stared out at the gray streets of Rockwell. What kind of institution had he been serving all these years? What kind of legacy had he inherited? The answer was now painfully clear. Behind him, Amelia's phone vibrated. She looked down and paled. Sir, you're going to want to see this. She turned her phone toward them. It was a live stream broadcast by a local journalist who had gotten wind of the incident. The headline read, Homeless man claims to own Langford Bank. Shocking documents reveal possible cover-up. In the background of the video, you can see the lobby, the plaque, and Isaiah's ledger sitting quietly on the desk. Charles rubbed his temples. They're spinning this as madness, he murmured. Let them, Isaiah said. Charles turned. Why? Because the truth doesn't fight like power does. It doesn't shout. It doesn't intimidate. It just waits until the lie crumbles on its own. Those words settled like thunder. For a brief second, no one spoke. Then Charles turned to Amelia. Get me the board of directors, all of them. Emergency session. Now. She hesitated. Sir, that might not... Do it. His voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. Amelia nodded and rushed out. As the door clicked closed, Charles turned back to Isaiah. You've started a war, Mr. Bennett. No, Isaiah said quietly. I just came to finish one. The boardroom atop the Langford Co Tower was a study in intimidation. Dark mahogany walls, long velvet drapes drawn halfway against the stormlit skyline. Portraits of Langford patriarchs loomed from above. Preston, Elias, Franklin, each framed in heavy gold, each gaze fixed in silent judgment. A long oval table stretched across the room like a battlefield. 12 chairs, 10 already filled with gray suits and grim faces. The board of directors. They were not used to being summoned, and certainly not for a matter involving a man they would not even name aloud in the invitation. At the far end sat Whitney Langford, her silver pen tapping rhythmically against her legal pad. Tick, 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 like the countdown to something explosive. The heavy double doors opened. Charles Denvers entered first, carrying a black briefcase, jaw tight with resolve. Behind him, steady as a shadow, walked Isaiah Bennett. The room fell into a vacuum of silence. A few board members exchanged whispers. Some stared. One man coughed softly, as if to clear away the discomfort clinging to the air. This is highly irregular, Whitney said coolly, not looking up. You were told to remove this man, not parade him through executive corridors. Charles ignored her. He placed the briefcase on the table, opened it, and withdrew the documents Isaiah had presented. This man has come with evidence, Charles said firmly. Evidence that suggests Langford Co. was founded on the back of a cover-up, a racial betrayal buried for 70 years, and I will not dismiss him without due review. Whitney's expression didn't change. You're overstepping your role. No, Charles countered. I'm fulfilling it. As a branch manager, I must report potential institutional misconduct, historical or current. A low murmur traveled across the board. Whitney folded her hands calmly. Let him speak, she said at last. Let him say whatever he's waited a lifetime to say. And then we'll be done. Isaiah stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam the table. He simply opened the ledger again, letting its pages fall open like a wound too long hidden. My name is Isaiah C.K. Bennett, he began. In 1951, I co-founded what you now call Langford Co. Bank. I signed the original deeds, I provided half the capital, I laid the first brick, and 6 months later, I was erased. The room remained still. Only the rain tapping softly at the window dared to answer him. I was told I was too visible, that a Negro man leading a financial institution would hurt investor confidence. So they forged paperwork. They buried my name. They paid off a judge. He placed the original deed on the table, folded, fragile, but screaming with truth. I was 29. I lost everything. Whitney let out a light breath, part exasperation, part pity. And now, at nearly 90, you've come to reclaim what exactly? Isaiah didn't blink. The truth. It wasn't a request. It was a declaration. Whitney turned to the board. This is a fairy tale, a story dressed in dust and pity, but the law demands more than stories. She stood. And to prove just how fragile these claims are, allow me to introduce someone who was there. A door behind her opened, and an old man, maybe in his late 80s, was wheeled in by an assistant. His suit was expensive but worn. His eyes were clouded but alert. Charles frowned. Isaiah's face went pale. Whitney smiled coldly. Gentlemen and ladies of the board, I give you Mr. Bernard Winslow, former legal clerk to Preston Langford during the founding year. Isaiah stared at him. Bernie? The old man's lips trembled, as if forming words hurt more than silence. Hello, Isaiah, Bernard rasped. The room held its breath. You were there, Isaiah said softly. You signed those papers. You saw what they did. Bernard didn't speak. His eyes darted between Isaiah and Whitney. Tell them, Bernie, Isaiah urged. Tell them I'm not crazy. Whitney placed a gentle hand on Bernard's shoulder. Just be honest, Mr. Winslow. That's all we ask. Bernard closed his eyes. A moment passed, then another, and then, his voice thin but steady. Isaiah's telling the truth. The words dropped like a stone into deep water. A ripple of disbelief passed through the boardroom. Whitney's face froze. He built that bank, Bernard said, louder now. He and Preston. I watched them shake hands. I typed the charter papers myself. But then things changed. Pressure from investors, threats from board advisors. I was told to help alter records, told to burn the originals. His eyes welled with tears. I was 22. I didn't understand what I was doing until it was too late. He looked at Isaiah. I'm sorry. Isaiah didn't speak. He couldn't. Whitney slammed her hand on the table. This is insanity. He's old, infirm. His memory is intact, Bernard said sharply. He pulled a worn folder from beneath his lap blanket. And I kept one page, just one. The original ledger registration. I couldn't bear to destroy it. He held it up, signed by Isaiah Bennett and Preston Langford. Stamped, notarized, date, March 17th, 1951. Charles reached for it with shaking hands. Silence fell. But this time it was reverent. Not because power demanded it, but because the truth had entered the room. Every lie now trembled in its presence. By the time the boardroom emptied, the storm outside had turned into a full deluge. Lightning cracked above the skyline of Rockwell, like the sky itself was splitting, and thunder rolled over the city with slow, reluctant groans. Much like the board members who shuffled out of the room, silent, shaken, and unsure. Inside the chamber, only 5 people remained. Charles Denvers, visibly worn. Isaiah Bennett, composed but quiet. Amelia Brooks, who had witnessed history unfold and now held it like fire in her chest. Whitney Langford, sitting motionless in her chair, like a queen surveying the ruins of her crumbling empire. And Bernard Winslow, who, for the first time in 70 years, had chosen truth over comfort. You know what you've done, Whitney said, her voice low, sharp as a scalpel. No one responded. She turned her glare to Charles. This entire board will come after you, and not just them. The Langford family, the shareholders. Every inch of this institution will move against you like blood rejecting a foreign body. Charles didn't blink. Then let it. It was the first time anyone had ever spoken to her like that, and lived to finish the sentence. Whitney stood, her fury now tightly coiled beneath polished restraint. You're not a hero, Charles. You're just naive. You think righteousness will save you, but it won't. The legal team is already preparing to discredit that document, and file an injunction to suppress it. The moment this becomes public, it will destroy everything, including you. Charles turned to Isaiah. You were erased from the bank's story, he said, and I was raised in that erasure. Every speech I gave, every Langford banner I hung, I was unknowingly guarding the grave of the man who built it. Isaiah didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Charles looked back at Whitney. If I have to lose this job to tell the truth, then maybe I never belonged in it to begin with. And with that, he gathered the ledger, the deed, and the newly uncovered document from Bernard. He closed the briefcase. Whitney's voice turned venomous. Then I hope you're ready to be buried next to him. Isaiah looked at her, finally breaking his silence. I've been buried for 70 years, he said calmly, but I never stopped breathing. The difference is, you've lived on a throne built on bones, and now the foundation is crumbling. Whitney said nothing, but her silence was not a victory. It was fear. Back in the lobby, Amelia watched from behind the front counter as Charles and Isaiah emerged from the elevator. Her fingers trembled over her phone. Sir, she said, holding up the screen, it's gone national. The headline burned on every news feed. Forgotten Black founder of Langford Bank emerges. Hidden truth shakes financial empire. Accompanied by a photo, Isaiah standing beside Charles at the boardroom table. The ledger is visible. The truth no longer whispers but screams. There are reporters outside, Amelia continued. Dozens, maybe more. And social media has gone into a frenzy. People are calling for a federal investigation. Charles nodded, his jaw tight. Let them in. Amelia hesitated. Are you sure? We're not hiding anymore. Isaiah watched him. There was pride in his eyes. Not boastful, but humbled. To him, this was not a victory. It was a reckoning. As Amelia turned to unlock the main doors, Charles looked at Isaiah. They're going to come after me now. Yes, Isaiah said simply, and I don't know what I'm going to lose. Isaiah placed a weathered hand on his shoulder. Maybe, but now you know what you're not willing to lose. That makes you freer than most men ever get to be. Just then, a new voice echoed from across the lobby. Mr. Denvers. A tall man in a dark suit approached. Behind him, a flash of cameras. My name is Reuben Clark, investigative attorney with the Department of Financial Integrity. I was sent after the first report hit our desk this morning. Mr. Bennett, if what you possess is legitimate, we're prepared to begin an emergency ethics audit and launch a federal inquiry into the Langford estate. Isaiah looked at Charles. Charles looked at Reuben, then back to Whitney's empty throne upstairs. And then, with the briefcase still clutched in his hand, he stepped forward. Let's begin. 2 days. That's all it took for the entire world around them to split apart. Within 48 hours of the story going national, the lobby of Langford Co transformed from a sanctuary of silence into a siege of spotlights. Reporters camped on sidewalks. Protesters gathered at the building steps, holding signs that read, "Say his name, Isaiah C.K. Bennett," and banks were built on bones. Inside the building, the tone was colder, sharper. The board of directors had convened an emergency session, but this time Isaiah wasn't invited, and neither was Charles. Instead, Charles Denvers received a letter. Not a phone call, not a meeting. A letter slid under his office door like a final insult. To Mr. Charles Denvers, effective immediately, you are placed on administrative leave pending internal review. Your access has been restricted. Please return all company property and exit the premises before the close of business. This action is not an admission of wrongdoing, but a standard response to reputational damage. Langford Co. Board of Directors. He read the letter twice, not because he didn't understand, but because he couldn't believe how quickly truth could cost you everything. When he stepped into the lobby with his coat folded over one arm and his key card deactivated, no one met his eyes. Not the tellers, not the guards. Only Amelia Brooks stood silently by the door, her hands clenched, eyes full of fire. I'm so sorry, she whispered. Don't be, Charles replied, managing a faint smile. Truth has never been welcome in palaces. She reached out, hesitated, then hugged him. It wasn't protocol, but nothing was anymore. Isaiah stood just outside, watching the farewell unfold under gray skies. He hadn't said a word yet. "So," Charles said when they were alone on the steps, "I guess I've officially been removed." Isaiah exhaled, his breath visible in the chilly morning air. "No, you've just been set free." Charles let out a small laugh. "Not bitter, just tired. Feels more like exile." "Sometimes," Isaiah said softly, "you have to be cast out of a broken system to start building something better." They stood side by side as cameras flashed across the street. The world was watching, and not everyone was pleased. Meanwhile, inside her penthouse suite overlooking Rockwell Square, Whitney Langford stared at 3 flat-screen monitors, news reports, social media dashboards, a live stream of protesters chanting her grandfather's name with disgust. She didn't move, didn't blink. A crystal glass of scotch remained untouched on her desk. Beside it lay a stack of folders, legal motions, injunctions, and an accelerated lawsuit to claim Isaiah's documents were forged and inadmissible. The attorneys had been mobilized, but so had something else. A ghost. Earlier that morning, a letter had arrived, hand-delivered by a young woman whose eyes looked too much like Preston Langford's. The letter, from inside the Langford line, "To the Langford Family Legal Division, my name is Margot Langford Price. I am the granddaughter of Preston Langford and the biological daughter of Ava Bennett Langford, the woman your family disowned in 1952 for marrying Isaiah C.K. Bennett in secret. Yes, you read that correctly. Isaiah Bennett is not only the man your legacy tried to erase, he is my grandfather. You may attempt to destroy him with press releases and motions, but you cannot erase me, or the bloodline I carry. I am submitting a formal petition to reopen the estate records from 1951 under federal witness protection and will testify to the fraud my family perpetuated in this bank's name. You may have money, but I have memory, and it's stronger than you think. Margot Langford Price, Idam, D." The letter trembled slightly in Whitney's hands, not from fear, from rage. The family had secrets, yes, but this was not supposed to resurface. Ava Bennett, Preston's rebellious, wild-hearted daughter, had been quietly banished and all records of her marriage dissolved in silence. Preston had declared it shameful. "Unfit for legacy," he'd said, and now her daughter, AEI, lawyer with Langford blood and Bennett blood, was preparing to destroy everything. Back on the street, Charles and Isaiah walked slowly through Rockwell's downtown corridor, passing shuttered cafes and newspaper stands lit with headlines about their names. "Do you believe it?" Charles asked. "That there's still a future for all this?" Isaiah stopped at the edge of a fountain. "I used to believe the future belonged to the powerful, but now I know it belongs to whoever refuses to forget." Just then, Charles's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. A single line of text from a blocked number. "She's coming. Her name is Margot." Charles looked up. "Who?" Isaiah furrowed his brow, and for the first time in years, perhaps decades, his voice faltered. "That was my daughter's name." A silence deeper than rain settled around them. "Isaiah," Charles whispered, "do you think she survived?" Isaiah didn't answer, but in his eyes something long extinguished flickered back to life. Hope. The rain had lightened to a mist. Rockwell shimmered beneath the overcast sky like a city caught between memory and reckoning. And outside Langford Co., where just days earlier no one would have dared speak Isaiah Bennett's name, now gathered a crowd waiting, not just for justice, but for something deeper. Truth, yes, but also family. Inside a quiet cafe across the street, Isaiah sat at a small round table, hands folded. His eyes were fixed on the doorway. Not a tremor in his fingers, but his breath was slow and deliberate, like each inhale required courage. Beside him sat Charles Denvers, no longer in a suit, no longer a bank man, but more of a man than he'd ever been. He was the one who had received the text. He was the one who arranged this meeting, but it was Isaiah's moment now. The door opened and she stepped in, tall, composed, hair pulled into a loose bun, raindrops clinging to the edges of her beige trench coat. Her eyes were bright, piercing, hazel with flecks of green, just like the portrait of Ava Langford that once hung above Preston's study. Isaiah didn't speak. He didn't need to, because somewhere inside his soul, a part of him recognized her before his mind even caught up. She saw him, paused, then crossed the room. "Mr. Bennett?" she asked softly. His voice cracked just slightly. "Call me Isaiah." A small silence fell. Then, "I'm Margot, Margot Langford Price. But I think you already knew that." Isaiah leaned back, his throat tightening. "You're Ava's, her daughter," Margot confirmed. "Your granddaughter." For a moment time broke. Not with fanfare, not with tears, but with stillness. A stillness so heavy it crushed every ticking clock in the room. "I thought she was gone," Isaiah whispered. "After Preston cut her off, no one knew." Margot's gaze softened. "She went underground, lived under a different name, moved to Canada for a while. She always told me never to contact the Langfords, but she never stopped talking about you. She kept my name? Every night, in stories, in the lullabies. She made you a myth, and I grew up chasing it." Isaiah looked down. His hands, once strong enough to carry bricks and ledgers, now trembled for the first time. "I thought I'd lost her forever." Margot reached across the table and gently touched his hand. "She died 3 years ago. Cancer. But before she passed, she gave me a letter. Said one day I'd know when to deliver it." She slid a sealed envelope across the table. A single name on the front. "To my father, I never forgot." Isaiah stared at it for a long time. He didn't open it. He simply held it, as if holding it made the years melt away. Meanwhile, across town, Whitney Langford stood in the center of a towering glass conference room, surrounded by 5 top attorneys, 3 crisis consultants, and a PR executive who hadn't slept in 48 hours. "They're preparing to sue us federally," one lawyer said. "The documents Margot Langford submitted corroborate Isaiah's claim. We're in real danger of a class action case." Whitney's voice was colder than ice. "Then we burn their credibility before it reaches a judge." "We tried that," the crisis manager interjected, "but the press has already shifted. Isaiah isn't just a claimant anymore. He's a symbol. And Margot? She's the missing heir. The story practically writes itself." Whitney paced, teeth clenched. "Then we don't attack the story. We attack the law." She turned sharply. "File a restraining order. Freeze any property claims. Demand an evidentiary hearing and bury it in motions." One of the attorneys hesitated. "That may only buy us time, not a win." Whitney's eyes blazed. "Then buy time." Back at the cafe, Isaiah finally looked up from the letter. "Why now, Margot?" "Because the lie is finally fragile enough to break. And the truth is finally strong enough to stand." Charles leaned in. "With her testimony and your documents, we have everything. The board's house of cards can't hold." Margot nodded. "I've filed to reopen the estate and formally add Isaiah to the bank's founding legal history. We'll go public at tomorrow's hearing, and I'll stand by you." Isaiah didn't speak for a moment. Then, "You're just like her." "I hope so," Margot said, her voice thick. "She loved you, and I think she knew this day would come." He reached across and gently took her hand, not as proof, but as a connection. Blood meeting blood. History meets the future. The hearing was set for 10 a.m. By 6:30, the Langford legal team had already filed 3 emergency motions. A petition to block Isaiah's claim on procedural grounds, a motion to question Margot's legitimacy as an heir, and a sealed request for injunctive silence, a gag order to prevent any press disclosures until after a private arbitration review. They weren't defending the truth. They were choking it with paperwork. In a quiet office near Rockwell District Court, Isaiah sat in a suit that didn't quite fit his shoulders anymore, the sleeves just a little too long. He wore no tie, only a folded letter in his jacket pocket. He hadn't opened Ava's words yet, not because he feared them, but because he already knew what they said. "You never stopped being my father." Across from him sat Margot, adjusting the cuffs of her blazer. She looked calm, too calm, but Charles could tell. Beneath the surface, she was bracing for a storm. "They're coming hard," Charles said, thumbing through a new motion that had just arrived by courier. Whitney's requesting a private evidentiary freeze. They want to lock your documents in judicial limbo until after the statute of limitations expires. They're stalling, Margot said. They know if we make it to that hearing, it's over. Which is why, Charles replied grimly, they won't let you get there. 8:02 a.m. Langford headquarters. Whitney Langford stood on the top floor of the Langford Tower, staring down at the city that once belonged to her family. She hadn't slept. Not well, anyway. The empire was fraying, threads coming loose in places she'd always thought stitched in steel. I want surveillance on Isaiah. Discreet. Legal or not, she ordered her assistant. He's just an old man, came the reply. He's a symbol, Whitney snapped. Symbols are harder to kill than people. She turned back toward her desk. On it sat an envelope, thicker than usual, no return address, hand-delivered. She opened it. Inside were three things. A printed copy of the founding deed, Isaiah's signature is visible. A photo of Margot as a child sitting in Ava's lap, and a handwritten note. There are some ghosts you shouldn't wake. They remember everything. For the first time in decades, Whitney felt something she hadn't allowed in years. Panic. 9 a.m. Outside the courthouse. The courthouse steps were a war zone. Protesters held up signs that read, "Give the man his name back," "Justice for Bennett," "Langford built on lies." News anchors set up live, counting down to the hearing, and standing in the middle of it all, Isaiah, Charles, and Margot. Charles straightened his jacket. They may still try to stop this from the inside, he warned. Margot gave a thin smile. Then we fight from the steps if we have to. Isaiah nodded but said nothing. He was too busy watching the building, not with fear, but with memory. This place once told me I didn't belong, he murmured. Today I'm walking in like I own it. A beat. Then his voice turned sharper, stronger. Because I did, and I still do. Just then a black SUV pulled up at the side entrance. Doors opened. A tall man in a federal marshal uniform stepped out, flanked by two agents. Are you Isaiah C.K. Bennett? He asked. Yes. You'll need to come with us, now. Why? Margot asked, stepping forward. He's due in court in an hour. We've received an executive order to detain Mr. Bennett for a protective hold. Potential threats. Routine federal process. That's not true, Charles said immediately. That's a Langford play. The agent didn't respond. He only extended a hand. Please, sir. Isaiah looked at Margot, then at Charles. Let them try, he said quietly, and then he walked into the car. 9:23 a.m., Rockwell Courthouse, back hall. Whitney stood inside the courthouse, her eyes scanning a secure hallway. She had paid dearly for this backdoor maneuver. Strings pulled, favors cashed, names whispered to power brokers who still owed her family. Isaiah wouldn't make it to the stand, and if he did, he would be painted as unstable, irrelevant. But then her phone buzzed. A news alert. Federal marshal confirms detainment of Isaiah Bennett, but records show no official order was issued. Her blood ran cold. A second notification followed. Judge Delaney orders immediate release, says Langford influence, cannot override due process. Whitney dropped the phone, because for the first time in her life, the system said no. 9:57 a.m., courthouse entry. 3 minutes before the hearing, the doors to the courtroom flew open, and there he was, Isaiah Bennett, flanked by Charles Denvers and Margot Langford Price. The reporters screamed questions. Flashes went off. People cried, but Isaiah walked slowly, head high. The letter was still in his pocket, ledger still in his hand, and in his eyes, not revenge, not pride, just peace. The courtroom was packed, not just with reporters and legal representatives, but with witnesses to a moment history had tried to forget. Citizens, students, elders, even a few former Langford employees who had come, not out of obligation, but out of something deeper. Conscience. At the center of it all sat Judge Lila Delaney, known for her composure, her intellect, and her zero tolerance for theatrics. She had once presided over billion-dollar corporate fraud cases and ruled with the force of a gavel that felt heavier than law. But even she seemed different today, softer, more human, as if the weight of this story had found a crack in her granite exterior. She adjusted her glasses, looked over the bench, and said simply, "Call your first witness." Charles nodded. "We call Isaiah C.K. Bennett." Isaiah rose slowly. No dramatics, no need for performance, only presence. He took the stand, was sworn in, and sat. The room hushed. The sound of his name, once erased, now echoed against courtroom walls with the dignity of something long overdue. "Mr. Bennett," Charles began gently, "do you understand the nature of today's hearing?" "I do." "And what is your claim before this court?" Isaiah looked up. His voice, though quiet, carried to the farthest row. "That I helped build Langford Co. Bank with my own hands. That I co-signed the founding deed. That I was then erased because I was black." A beat, no one moved. "I don't want revenge," he said. "I want the truth restored. I want my name back where it belongs." He placed the original 1951 deed in the ledger on the witness table. Charles nodded, turning to the judge. "Let the court note that the documents have been verified by 2 independent forensic teams and that Ms. Margot Langford Price has submitted DNA and sworn testimony confirming familial lineage between herself, Mr. Bennett, and Ava Langford, daughter of Preston Langford." The courtroom murmured. Judge Delaney raised a hand. "Order." Then she turned to Isaiah. "Do you wish to read the letter you brought with you, Mr. Bennett?" Isaiah hesitated, then nodded. His fingers trembled slightly as he opened the envelope. Ava's handwriting, faded but steady. "Papa, I'm sorry I couldn't come back. They made it impossible. But I never forgot the man who held my hand when I took my first steps. You didn't lose me. They took me. But today they can't take my words. I love you." "Ava." Isaiah paused. He didn't cry. He simply folded the letter and whispered, "That's all I ever needed." A silence followed, but not the awkward kind, the sacred kind. A silence so deep that even the judge didn't interrupt it. And then, Whitney Langford stood. Her voice, though elegant, was laced with venom. "Your Honor, the Langford estate rejects these documents as manipulated. We motion that this entire claim be struck from the record as inadmissible under Section 31 of Corporate Legacy Law." This, Judge Delaney held up a hand. "Ms. Langford." Whitney froze. "Enough." The word hit like a verdict. "You've submitted 36 motions in 2 days. You've tried to delay, deny, and derail, but what you've never done is refute the truth." A beat. "The deed is valid. The bloodline is real. The history is undeniable, and this court will not participate in burying it again." Whitney sat down, slowly, silently, like a monarch watching her crown melt. The ruling: "It is the finding of this court that Isaiah C.K. Bennett shall be reinstated as legal co-founder of Langford Co. Bank, retroactive to March 17, 1951. All official records are to be updated to reflect this status. Furthermore, the Langford estate is ordered to release a public statement acknowledging its decades-long omission and to provide full reparative compensation as determined by the estate court." Silence again, but this time it didn't feel empty. It felt like justice breathing for the first time. Outside the court, as the doors opened, Isaiah stepped out. He didn't raise his hands, didn't wave to the crowd. He simply stood at the top of the stairs, letter in hand, ledger under his arm, and closed his eyes for one long moment, letting the wind carry it all away. Margot stood beside him, wiping silent tears. Charles followed, unsure what to say, until Isaiah placed a hand on his shoulder. "You didn't save me," Isaiah said. "You just made sure no one could erase me again." And then he walked down the steps. Each step is light. Each step is free. Epilogue: The Plaque. 6 weeks later, a new bronze plaque was unveiled inside the bank lobby. It read, "Founded 1951, Preston Langford and Isaiah C.K. Bennett. Built with the hands of vision. Reclaimed by truth." Visitors come every day now. Some in silence, some with tears. But all of them leave with something they didn't have before. Belief. That even when the truth is buried for 70 years, it still grows roots. And one day, it rises. Closing message and real-world lesson. In a world that often rewards silence and forgetfulness, Isaiah C.K. Bennett chose memory. He chose dignity over comfort, truth over convenience. And in doing so, he reminded us of a simple but powerful truth. You can erase a name from paper, but you cannot erase a life lived with purpose. For 70 years, Isaiah walked through life carrying a silence that wasn't his fault. A silence forced upon him by power, by racism, by the fear of what it would mean to acknowledge what was taken. But when he finally spoke, he didn't shout. He stood, and the world had no choice but to listen. Real-world lesson: never underestimate the quiet strength of truth. It may sleep, but it never dies. Speak up, even if your voice shakes, because your story might be the key to someone else's freedom. And finally, don't just remember history, rewrite it. When you see injustice, when you feel erased, step forward. Not for revenge, but for restoration. Because in the end, justice isn't loud, it's persistent.